Why do you keep falling in love with people who are falling apart? Not the loud kind of broken, the quiet kind. The ones with tired eyes and stories they never fully tell. The ones who say, "I'm fine," in a voice that sounds like hollow glass, and somehow you feel drawn to them. You listen longer than anyone else would. You stay when others walk away. You try to understand the parts of them that even they can't explain. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispers something dangerous. If I love them enough, maybe I can save them. But the real question is not why they are broken. The real question is why their brokenness feels so familiar to you. There is a certain kind of person who doesn't just fall in love with someone. They fall in love with someone's wounds. They notice pain the way others notice beauty. They sense sadness hidden behind smiles. They read emotional signals the way a musician reads notes on a page. And when they meet someone who is hurting, something inside them awakens. A quiet mission, a deep pull, an invisible promise. I will understand you. Psychologists sometimes call this pattern pathological altruism, the unconscious drive to heal others, even when it slowly breaks you. But beneath that clinical term lies something far more human. A childhood where you learned that love and suffering were tangled together, where caring for someone meant carrying their emotional storms, where peace in the room depended on how well you managed someone else's pain. When a child grows up in an environment like that, psychologists call it parentification. The child becomes the emotional caretaker long before they understand their own emotions. And over time, that child becomes an adult who feels strangely comfortable around damaged souls. Because broken people speak a language you learned very early in life. Their silence feels familiar. Their pain feels understandable. Their chaos feels like home. You don't seek them out consciously, but your nervous system recognizes them instantly. It's like two wounded parts of the world quietly finding each other in a crowded room. And before you even realize it, you're already trying to heal them. This story usually begins long before your first relationship. It begins in childhood. Imagine a small child sitting in a quiet room. Maybe they're watching their parent cry. Maybe they're listening to arguments echo through thin walls. Maybe they're simply sensing tension floating through the air like invisible smoke. Children are incredibly sensitive emotional instruments. Their brains are wired with mirror neurons, which means they absorb the emotions of the people around them. So when a parent is overwhelmed, anxious, angry, or depressed, the child feels it. But here's the problem. Children don't have the power to change their environment. They can't fix the arguments. They can't stop the sadness. They can't stabilize the chaos. So their brain creates a survival strategy. If I become the calm one, maybe things will be okay. You begin learning how to read moods the way sailors read weather patterns. You become hyper-aware of every sigh, every shift in tone, every subtle emotional storm forming in the room. Psychologists call this hypervigilance. But to a child, it just feels like responsibility. Maybe you learn to comfort a parent who should have been comforting you. Maybe you became the peacemaker in family conflicts. Maybe you felt like the emotional glue holding everything together. In those moments, something quietly changes inside you. Your brain begins linking love with responsibility. Caring becomes your identity. Healing becomes your role. And slowly, the child disappears behind the caretaker. The part of you that needed protection gets buried beneath layers of empathy and strength. Carl Jung once described this buried part of the self as the shadow, the hidden pieces of who we are that we learn to suppress. And for many people who fall in love with broken partners, that shadow holds a very specific wound. A child who learned that love means fixing someone else's pain. So years later, when you meet someone who is struggling, something ancient wakes up inside you. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because your nervous system whispers, "This is what love looks like." If this psychology lives inside you, it doesn't show up in obvious ways. It appears quietly in the patterns of your relationships. You might notice that you are almost magnetically drawn to people with complicated pasts, people who carry invisible wounds, people who warn you early on that they're not easy to love. And instead of walking away, you lean closer. You feel curiosity where others feel caution, because your mind has always been fascinated by emotional puzzles. You might also notice that you become the emotional thermostat in every relationship. When they're anxious, you become calm. When they're angry, you become patient. When they collapse, you become strong. It feels natural to regulate the emotional temperature of the room, but the cost is subtle. Your own emotions slowly become background noise. Another sign is the quiet habit of people-pleasing. also known in trauma psychology as the fawn response. Instead of fighting or fleeing conflict, you instinctively move towards soothing it. You soften your opinions. You suppress your needs. You shape yourself into whatever version of you will keep the other person from hurting. Not because you're weak, but because somewhere in your past, peace depended on it. Over time, this creates something else: hyper-independence. You become incredibly good at handling your own struggles alone. You don't ask for help easily. You don't lean on others the way they lean on you, because deep down, you feel more comfortable being the healer than the one who needs healing. You may also notice something strange about the way you interpret love. Stability sometimes feels boring. Healthy partners might seem emotionally distant, even when they're not. Meanwhile, someone who is chaotic, wounded, unpredictable, somehow feels more emotionally intense. This is the nervous system chasing familiarity. Your brain mistakes emotional turbulence for connection. And then there is the quiet exhaustion, the kind that doesn't come from physical work but from emotional labor. Psychologists call it compassion fatigue, the slow draining of empathy that happens when you carry too much of someone else's pain for too long. But even then, you keep giving. Because another pattern is self-gaslighting. You tell yourself things like, maybe they'll change soon. Maybe they just need more understanding. Maybe I'm expecting too much. You become incredibly forgiving of other people's wounds while quietly ignoring your own. And perhaps the most invisible sign of all is this: you measure your worth by how much you can help someone heal. Your value becomes tied to the emotional rescue missions you undertake. You don't just love people, you try to rebuild them, and sometimes you'll lose yourself in the process. Psychology has studied this pattern for decades. Researchers studying attachment theory have found that children who grow up in emotionally unpredictable environments often develop what is called anxious or caretaking attachment styles. Their brains learn that closeness requires effort, patience, and emotional labor. Studies from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology suggest that individuals with high empathy in early caregiving roles are significantly more likely to choose partners who display emotional distress or instability. Why? Because their brains have become highly skilled at reading emotional pain. Neuroscience explains part of this through mirror neurons, which allow us to feel and interpret the emotions of others almost instantly. For someone who grew up managing other people's emotions, these neural systems become extremely active. You sense suffering faster than most people, and your brain responds with a powerful urge to reduce it. There's also something called locus of control. When children grow up believing that their actions can stabilize chaotic environments, they develop an internal belief that they can influence the emotional outcomes of others. So when a partner struggles, the brain whispers, "If I just try harder, maybe I can fix this." Carl Jung described this as part of our shadow dynamics, unconscious patterns formed in childhood that guide our relationships long into adulthood. Not because we want pain, but because the psyche constantly searches for unresolved wounds to finally heal, even if it means replaying them. But here's what no one tells you. The role of the healer can slowly become a prison, because when your identity revolves around saving others, you unconsciously choose people who need saving, not people who are ready to stand beside you, people who are drowning. And for a while, it feels meaningful. You listen for hours. You comfort their breakdowns. You stay during the moments when others would walk away. It gives you purpose. But over time, the emotional gravity changes. You begin carrying two lives instead of one. Their pain becomes your responsibility. Their growth becomes your project. Their healing becomes your mission. And if they don't change, something inside you quietly blames yourself. You wonder if you weren't patient enough, kind enough, loving enough. This is where complex trauma, often called cptsd, quietly shows itself in adult relationships. Your nervous system has been trained to endure emotional storms for long periods of time. So what would overwhelm others, you tolerate. You normalize emotional chaos. You call it love. Meanwhile, something else is happening beneath the surface. The part of you that needed care, the buried child, is still waiting. Still hoping someone will finally notice your exhaustion. Still hoping someone will say, "You don't have to hold the whole world anymore." But because you've spent so long being the strong one, people rarely see that side of you. They see kindness. They see patience. They see strength. What they don't see is the silent screaming of a soul that has carried too much for too long. And perhaps the most painful truth is this: sometimes Trying to save broken people is actually a subconscious attempt to heal the version of yourself that was never saved. But let me tell you something important. This part of you is not a flaw. Your empathy is not weakness. Your ability to understand pain is not something that needs to disappear. It simply needs boundaries. Healing begins the moment you realize that love is not the same thing as emotional rescue. You are allowed to care without carrying. You are allowed to listen without fixing. And most importantly, you are allowed to choose partners who meet you in strength, not only in suffering. And this requires something Carl Jung called shadow work, gently meeting the hidden parts of yourself that were forced to grow up too quickly, the child who became the caretaker, the voice that believed love had to be earned through sacrifice. When you begin healing that inner child, something remarkable happens. You stop searching for people to save. Instead, you start searching for people who can walk beside you, people who respect your empathy rather than consume it, people who don't need your emotional labor to function. And slowly, the invisible weight you've carried for years begins to lift, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring for yourself too. If you see yourself in this story, I want you to hear this clearly. You were never meant to carry the entire emotional world of another human being. Your kindness was never supposed to suffocate you. You were a child who learned how to survive by becoming strong for everyone else. But you are not that child anymore. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to choose love that feels calm, stable, and mutual. You are allowed to let someone else hold the weight for once. And the most beautiful part, the empathy that once trapped you can also become the thing that sets you free. Because when you finally turn that same compassion toward yourself, the garden that once withered begins to grow again. And this time, you are not saving anyone. You are finally learning how to live.